Salt. The humble white crystals that sit quietly on kitchen counters today were once powerful enough to spark wars, build empires, and decide the fate of entire civilizations. Long before it became something we sprinkle on fries without a second thought, salt was treasured as if it were pure gold. And in many ways it was. In ancient times, salt was not only a flavoring agent, it was a preservative, currency, a symbol of purity, and a sacred offering. Entire cities grew up around salt roots. Economies flourished or collapsed depending on who controlled the supply. To call salt worth its weight in gold was not poetic exaggeration. It was fact. The story of salt begins far back in prehistory. Before refrigeration, salt was the best method humans had to preserve food. Meat, fish, and vegetables could be kept from spoiling for weeks or even months when cured with salt. This one simple mineral allowed early humans to store food through long winters and dry seasons, to travel long distances with provisions in tow, and to settle in places where fresh food was not always available. Salt meant survival, but it was not just about practicality. Salt carried spiritual weight too. It was seen as pure, incorruptible, and divine in many cultures. In ancient Rome, spilling salt was considered bad luck, a superstition that continues today. Roman soldiers were sometimes paid in salt, a practice that gave rise to the word salary. Their monthly allotment of salt was called salarium, a testament to its value. This wasn't some quirky historical footnote. It was a cornerstone of imperial logistics. Armies on the march needed preserved rations. Roads were built primarily to transport salt. Roman engineering prowess, which left us with aqueducts and colosseums, was also applied to solving the salt supply chain. Wherever salt could be found, power followed. In ancient China, salt taxes funded dynasties. One of the earliest state-run monopolies in Chinese history was over the salt trade. Emperors knew that whoever controlled salt controlled the people. It was a dependable source of revenue and a tool for political stability. When governments monopolized salt, they could both enrich themselves and weaken rivals. Peasant uprisings sometimes began with protests over salt taxes. Control over salt was control over the very ability of families to eat and survive. The Sahara trade routes were not just about gold and ivory. Salt was just as crucial. Camel caravans carried enormous slabs of salt across the desert, exchanging them for gold in the West African kingdoms of Mali and Ghana. These exchanges took place in cities like Timbuktu and Tagaza, where salt was hewn from dry lake beds and packed like bricks. In a literal sense, salt was traded ounce for ounce with gold. Traders knew its worth, and so did kings. The rulers of Mali built their wealth on gold, yes, but also on the salt that sustained their subjects and their armies. Salt routes crisscrossed Europe and the Middle East, linking civilizations in a web of dependency and trade. In France, entire regions became prosperous because of salt production. In the Middle Ages, the French levied a tax on salt known as the gabelle. It was so hated that it fueled resentment leading up to the French Revolution. In Venice, salt made the city rich. Its lagoons became salt pans. And Venetian merchants used their strategic control of the Adriatic to distribute salt throughout the Mediterranean. Venetian ships didn't just carry silk and spices. They were floating warehouses of salt, and the profits funded the splendor of the doges. Even the Crusades were partially influenced by the politics of salt. Crusader states in the Levant depended on shipments of salted food from Europe. A break in the salt supply could leave soldiers starving. Salted cod and meat were standard rations for knights and pilgrims alike. In many medieval homes, salt was locked in special boxes and kept under guard. Guests were seated according to their proximity to the salt cellar on the table. Being above the salt meant higher status. Salt etiquette reflected social hierarchy, and possession of salt was a visible sign of wealth and influence. Religions, too, recognized salt's symbolic power. In Judaism and Christianity, salt was a sign of covenant and faithfulness. It was used in purification rituals and offerings. Jesus called his followers the salt of the earth, meaning they were essential, preserving what was good in the world. In Islam, salt has been used traditionally to start and end meals, believed to bring blessings and balance. Across Asia and Africa, salt was offered in ceremonies, sometimes mixed with water, sometimes buried at corners of new buildings to ward off evil spirits. Salt was tied so closely to human life that wars broke out over it. In the 16th century, conflicts erupted in India over salt production rights. In the 19th century, the British imposed a salt tax in colonial India, sparking protests that culminated in Mahatma Gandhi's famous Salt March. In 1930, Gandhi walked 240 miles to the Arabian Sea, where he bent down and picked up a pinch of salt, defying British law. That simple gesture electrified the independence movement. It was not just a protest over taxation. It was a reclaiming of dignity and self-sufficiency. Salt, once again, stood at the center of power and resistance. It is easy now to forget how rare salt once was. Today it is mass-produced in factories and sold in plastic shakers for pennies. Table salt is mined from the earth or evaporated from seawater in enormous industrial operations. It comes fortified with iodine and anti-caking agents. You can buy sea salt, Himalayan pink salt, smoked salt, and dozens of gourmet varieties, all arranged on brightly lit grocery shelves. Salt has become so ordinary that its historical mystique seems almost surreal. But for much of human history, salt was nothing short of magical. It preserved life, fed armies, supported trade empires, funded governments, and inspired revolts. It flavored not just food but politics, religion, and ritual. It was precious not because it was rare in nature, salt is found almost everywhere, but because it took immense effort to gather and refine. Before machines and modern chemistry, producing salt required patience, ingenuity, and labor. From boiling seawater to scraping mineral crusts off desert floors, salt production was grueling work. Communities formed around salt works. Families passed down salt-making techniques. In Japan, salt-making was even considered a sacred art. In Ethiopia, bars of salt called amole were used as money well into the 20th century. In Central Europe, salt mines were so deep and dangerous that miners prayed before descending. They carved chapels underground, lit by flickering lamps, surrounded by walls of glistening white crystals. These were cathedrals to a substance more vital than silver. The history of salt is the history of human need and ingenuity. From the earliest brine pits to the industrial saltworks of today, we have gone to extraordinary lengths to harvest something our bodies cannot live without. Sodium is essential to nerve function, hydration, and muscle movement. Without it, we die. Too much of it today can harm us, but too little once spelled disaster. Our craving for salt is hardwired into our biology. That craving drove exploration, conquest, and innovation. It brought people together, and at times, tore them apart. Even in modern expressions, we still nod to salt's ancient power. A person of integrity is said to be worth their salt. A bitter experience is taken with a grain of salt. When people say salt of the earth, they are invoking not just moral worth, but the essential value that salt once held in every human society. So the next time you reach for that shaker on the table, remember you are touching a piece of history. Not just culinary history, but the history of civilization itself. Salt is more than a seasoning. It is a survivor, a witness to empires rising and falling, companion on long journeys across deserts and seas, symbol of purity, permanence, and passion. It is not an exaggeration to say salt was once worth its weight in gold. In some places and sometimes it was worth even more. Thanks for sticking with us through the incredible journey of salt, a tiny crystal with a colossal history. Asked from ancient empires and sacred rituals to wars, revolutions, and everyday meals. Salt has shaped humanity in ways we often overlook. It wasn't just something to flavor dinner. It was a currency, a symbol of power, a cause for rebellion, and a lifeline for survival. Civilizations rose and fell around it. Roads were carved through mountains to move it. People risked everything just to hold it in their hands. So next time you pass the salt at the table, remember the stories it carries. This unassuming mineral has been worth its weight in gold, and in many ways it still is. Whether you use it to cure, to season, or simply to savor, you are participating in a long shared history of human need and ingenuity. If you enjoyed this dive into the surprisingly dramatic past of salt, give this video a like and share it with someone who loves history with flavor. And don't forget to subscribe for more tales where everyday things turn out to be anything but ordinary. Until next time, stay curious and keep your stories well seasoned.